at C.O. Johnson Park in Byram Township, New Jersey, where we are here for Part 7 on the Lackawanna Cut-Off, Roseville Tunnel. Hi, I'm Chuck Walsh, President of the North Jersey Rail Commuter Association, and this is really the best place to access Roseville Tunnel. There are other ways to do it which I would not recommend, but this one you can park for, and if you look over in this direction to your left, there you can see where the trees are, and the tunnel is somewhere underneath there, which we're going to take a visit to very shortly. Just want to point out that this road here, Roseville Road, is closed on this end because the bridge over the cutoff is being replaced. That will probably be out of service at least until the middle part, if not late into the year 2017. In this direction it is open, however. Roseville Road is the only road on the cutoff which crosses either over it or under it in 3 different locations. The bridge, and then there are also 2 underpasses which are east of here. So, off to the tunnel itself, we're going to look not only on top of the tunnel, but below in the tunnel itself. And then there's also a connector, which is has an interesting background and history as well. Okay, here we are on top of Roseville Tunnel. Now, as you can see, I had to do a little bit of trudging through this little bit of a culvert, if you would call it. Well, the story behind Roseville Tunnel is that it wasn't planned to be a tunnel. You can see here, this is where they started to blast away. In fact, they've blasted away quite a bit. If you look way up on top here, across through here, they've taken at least close to 30 feet off the top of the tunnel, if not more. Now, the question is why did they not continue to make a cut as opposed to then deciding to make a tunnel? Well, they started construction. The David W. Flickweir Construction Company started construction somewhere in August of 1908 on what would have been Colby Cut. In October of 1909, we're talking now about 14 months later, during one of their trial bores into the rock and soil here, they find what they call an anticline, which is, I'm not a geologist, so forgive me, but essentially the layers that you find geologically underneath the ground, usually like this, get an anticline. What happens is that it's been pushed up, and you get an area where almost like a bulge, if you will, going up towards the surface. Anyway, this kind of basically freaked out the engineers, and when they pulled out some of the rock material, it was so decomposed or degraded that it was almost like you could scoop it up with your hand. They called it it looked like Roquefort cheese, basically. So, to make a long story short, they went to President Truesdale, which you can just imagine after our discussion and throughout our previous Part 6 about the tunnels on the old road, that the last thing they wanted to do is have a tunnel on the new road, or the cutoff. But President Truesdale did eventually consent, and by December of 1909, the construction on Roseville Tunnel began. Now, if we go back even before the decision about this, there was actually a thought being given that they would not go through this area at all when they were making plans for the cutoff, and that the line would skirt this hill here and go north and then go south and then come north again. It would have been like one of these. That route was discarded. That was line M. But it was well known that this might be problematic, but they didn't anticipate that they'd actually have to end up with a tunnel. So what we're going to do is we're going to move over, take a look at Colby Cut, and then from there we're going to take a little bit of a walk down an interesting bit of right-of-way that probably the people who come here and walk on the trail don't really realize what the history is behind that particular right-of-way. Here we are at Colby Cut, which is behind me here. Unfortunately not very dramatic looking at it, at least at this point in time, because of all the trees that are inside of the cut itself. If you look at some previous photos, it's a lot more dramatic, and when the rehabilitation of this section of the cutoff is done, those trees will most likely all be removed, and there'll be some other work that'll be done here, so it'll be you'll be able to see probably all the way to the bridge over Roseville, that's on Roseville Road, which is a little over half a mile from here, which you cannot possibly see with all these trees now. Now, Colby Cut as it is about 2,800 feet long and the maximum of 110 feet deep. It was the deepest cut on the cutoff, but not the largest. We looked at Armstrong Cut in the Johnsonburg segment that we did on the cutoff, and that was by far the largest cut. However, when this cut was done, and also in view of the instability of the rock through which the cut was supposed to go, when Armstrong Cut collapsed in 1941, the Lackawanna looked at this cut and had concerns that maybe that could happen here as well. There have been rock slides over the years, and there's also been protection which has been put up, even a rock slide fence on this side, to the north side of the cut. They even had a shanty man who was posted here from probably about the time of World War II, probably just after the collapse at Armstrong Cut. And his job was to keep an eye on things and see if in fact there was a rock slide, that he would stop the trains so there wouldn't be a derailment. So in any case, our next stop here is going to be a little bit of a trip down a right-of-way that connects between the cut that is up above the tunnel and the actual tunnel itself. There's a nice trail that goes from the top of the tunnel to the actual tunnel itself below. This isn't a trail that was made by something like Green Acres in New Jersey or something. This was actually a right-of-way for narrow gauge locomotives that would pull cars from above with blasted material or scooped material, and that during the days when they were moving the material from on top of the tunnel for use primarily to the east of here, like Wharton Fill, which is beyond the eastern portal of the tunnel. But otherwise, it's something that was very nice to have it here, but I would imagine that most people don't realize that this was actually, there were trains that ran on this particular, not full-size, narrow gauge trains, but trains nonetheless that were used for the construction of the cutoff. And we're now going to walk down this trail, and we'll go down to the eastern portal of Roseville Tunnel. Here we are just east of the eastern portal of Roseville Tunnel. We've come down the narrow gauge right-of-way. In fact, right here is another area which has been apparently removed, and we're on a little bit of a fill now. This would be the Wharton fill. What you just saw where that lake house is on what is called Wright Pond, W-R-I-G-H-T pond in Byram Township. It's not clear when the Lackawanna was looking at President Truesdale's correspondence files going back prior to the time, which is September 1906, where the actual route that was going to be used for the cutoff had been determined. I'm talking about March, I think, of 1906. There's correspondence between Mr. Colby, which we know him from Colby Cut, which is on the other side of the tunnel. The Lackawanna at that time was still apparently considering the possibility of the line actually going in this direction around the north side of what would be now Roseville Tunnel, and then coming back down south and dipping down into what had been Tranquility and then back up towards Johnsonburg. At that time, there was the correspondence between Colby and President Truesdale indicated that Colby was interested in putting a train station on his property. Not really sure where that would have been, because Colby actually didn't own a whole lot of what became Colby Cut. There were several landowners who divided up that area that was eventually became the Cut, and probably because of the alliterative nature of the name Colby Cut, that probably was the one that stuck in terms of when it seemed like the one that everyone liked, maybe the best. But Colby made this offer. Truesdale sent him to Lincoln Bush, who was at that point was still the Lackawanna chief engineer. We know him from the Bush train sheds in Hoboken, for example. But and Bush would eventually join Mr. Flickweir for this section here, including Roseville Tunnel, but that would be still a couple of years in the future at that point. In any case, this is a very scenic spot. You can't really see too well because of the trees, but Wright Pond is a very scenic spot here. So our next stop is going to be going into the tunnel itself. Here we are at the eastern portal of Roseville Tunnel, inside of what I'll call a mini cut. When they rehabilitate the tunnel, a short section of rehabilitation such that preventing any kind of rock fall will actually occur out there. But most of that work is going to be done on the western portal, which we'll visit in just a moment. Two things I want to point out here, which are kind of interesting, you're looking up. First of all, up here on the side of this rock wall, you can see a bunch of bolts that have been drilled into the rock at different angles. Presumably, at some point, maybe even at the time of construction or later on, there was concern that piece of rock there was going to possibly come down, and they used the bolts to secure it. The other thing is above me here, you can see this vertical line in the rock, and presumably that was either a test bore or even where they would put the pipe down and actually insert dynamite charges and blast out the side of the at the time that they were creating a cut. That would not have necessarily been used for when they were creating the tunnel, because the tunnel is below that. One of the things when they actually rehabilitate this tunnel as part of the New Jersey Transit project is that they're actually going to have to remove part of the tunnel. The tunnel is 1,024 feet long. And apparently there is, and I've never been able to locate it, but apparently I've been told that there is a stipulation that when you build a new tunnel, this is not a new tunnel, but when you abandon a tunnel and then start, it's almost as if you're doing a new tunnel. when you build a new tunnel, any tunnel that's 1,000 feet or more requires some sort of air ventilation system. Well, presumably they didn't want to have to undergo that expense, and one can imagine the environmental issues that might be associated with trying to bore down from up on top where we were and then creating some sort of air vent to exhaust out any kind of fumes in the tunnel. Diesel fumes would be. So as a result, what they will do is remove at least 15 feet, could either be from this side or the other side, or maybe a combination of the two, we don't know, to shorten the tunnel so that is technically under 1,000 feet. So that's part of the project, and when we go to the other end of the tunnel, I'll actually read to you what is in the contract. It was from the bidding contract of all the work that's going to be done inside the tunnel and then primarily over in Colby Cut. Here we are in Roseville Tunnel, almost in the exact middle of the tunnel. You could see ice. Now, ice was a problem. It's a problem in many tunnels. It was a problem here. And talking about the shanty man, one of his jobs would have been to come in, probably with a pick or something, and to make sure that the ice was not causing a problem on the tracks. Over here, it's not really a big issue, but to actually have ice coming over the tracks could be a major issue, depending on how much ice there was. It's cool in here, but it's not real cold. There are no bats. There's no Indiana bats or any other kind of bats that would hang out in here because it's an open-ended tunnel. If it were closed, that would be a different story. Then it would be a cave. So our next stop, we're going to move over to the western portal of the tunnel and describe what's going to happen over there, and also look at a section of the tunnel which has been lined years ago to presumably protect from any kind of cave-in from above. Well, as we move closer to the western portal, we've stopped here because we're going to give you a few moments of listening to water coming through the tunnel walls. Here we are very close to the western portal of Roseville Tunnel. You can see here that there's a section that's been, I'll say added, but it's actually about 100-foot section where a concrete lining has been added, which has been deteriorating, but it presumably is an area where there must have been problems either with water, and we can see huge chunks of ice that are sitting down here, so that might be the issue that they actually were addressing, or maybe that there was an instability which they detected and wanted to shore up the ceiling of the tunnel in this spot. Whatever the case is, when they come through here and do the rehabilitation, this is one section they're most likely going to have to concentrate on, because there must be something above us that's causing this problem. But as you just heard, and we were just on the other side of the lining, that's where all that water is coming down. And even here you could hear it drip, 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 drip. So clearly a significant problem with water seepage coming into the tunnel. Next stop, western portal. Here we are at the western portal of Roseville Tunnel. As you can see, looks a little bit different than the eastern portal. We're surrounded on all sides by Colby Cut. That's this deep cut we've been talking about, which we saw from above here. To address that, and this was we'll call it an old-fashioned type of remedy, they had slide detectors. This was installed probably around 1950. These poles supported this fencing, which presumably electrified or somehow would trigger the signals to go to red and would stop any train that would be coming through here. Presumably if it was a big enough rock to actually set off the slide detector. Now I'm going to give a little bit of a plug for a Wikipedia pages on the cutoff. You see that at the end of all our videos. We have a presence on social media such as Facebook and Twitter and so forth. Wikipedia, though, there's some really nice articles on the cutoff. There are two in particular. There's one about the historic cutoff, in other words, about the concept of the cutoff and building it and all the way through the end when the tracks are removed and so forth. And then there's a second article which concentrates on the New Jersey Transit project to Andover, and then also talks about future prospects for service on the line. There are also sub-articles about, you name it basically, about having to do with the cutoff, including Roseville Tunnel, which I'm going to read something about momentarily. But Port Morris, Slateford, the two viaducts, all the stations, the cuts, the fills, all have separate pages that are linked to the cutoff page. So if you have time, poke around there. I'm one of the authors. There have been a number of authors, and I think collectively we've done I'll pat myself on the back. We've done a pretty good job with and trying to vet the information so that because I know sometimes Wikipedia has a sort of sketchy reputation sometimes, but I think the articles are really pretty good, and they're as accurate as possibly, because we've used really good sources as best we can. So, talking about what's going to happen here when New Jersey Transit, which is, as we speak, in the bidding process for work on not only Roseville Tunnel, but Colby Cut and going all the way to Andover Station. We'll discuss in future episodes about the hold-up with the environmental issues, but this section here, the tunnel and approximately 8,000 feet from here to towards Andover are not subject to that. Those environmental permits have been approved. So this project can proceed, although it's, not to say it's not going as fast as we'd like, but in any case, here's what's going to be done. I mean, it's quite a project. It's $24 million. And I'm going to read it. This is right out of, well, not only Wikipedia, but the Wikipedia article is based on the actual contract. Let me read this. It's going to, the tunnel work will involve removal of loose rock, as we've seen on a lot of places, rock bolting to secure unstable rock blocks, which we saw, which has already been done way in the past on the eastern side of the tunnel, repair to the existing concrete tunnel liner, which we just looked at, as a matter of fact, installation of a membrane liner that will provide continuous tunnel waterproofing system. Well, you can see with all the drip, 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 that's definitely needed. Installation of a closed-circuit television camera, I wouldn't call it a network, but a system, one at each portal. Installation of lighted pedestrian path inside the tunnel. This will be so that workers can come through, not that we're going to have, hopefully, people on dirt bikes. The tunnel will extend, the path will extend a minimum of 50 feet beyond each portal. The radio system will have to be installed. That's so that when trains go through the tunnel, they will continue to have a signal. And the actual tunnel length will be reduced by a minimum of 15 feet, which we've talked about as well. Also includes railroad track bed and excavation, initial ballast placement and rock excavation and slope protection, stabilization of loose and potentially loose rock from both the west and east rock cut approaches to the tunnel. This slope protection shall address rockfall hazard protection, as we've seen up here, that's needed. Netting, vegetation and tree removal, get rid of all these trees. And that protection shall extend approximately 1,700 feet from the west portal, and then 200 feet from the east portal. And it will also include a section of track roadbed restoration beyond the west portal, including cutting, clearing, et cetera, trees and vegetative, going approximately 8,000 feet long from here. And it'll be, once that actual work begins, it'll be 2 years in the making. So if we project now, we're now in, as we speak, February of 2017, we're talking about rail service to Andover, which is about a mile or mile and a half from here west in that direction, probably starting no earlier than 2019. Unfortunately, we'd like to see it faster, but that's the reality of the situation. So anyway, but if you get a chance, certainly take a look at Wikipedia. Some nice articles there and a lot of information about the project, where we try to keep up to date, as a matter of fact. So this is Roseville Tunnel. Certainly one of the highlights on the cutoff. As we mentioned, it wasn't supposed to be a tunnel, but it is a tunnel, and actually adds something to the experience of riding over the cutoff, because you get a tunnel as well, and we'll have to live with it. It's because it is what it is. So this is the end of segment 7 of the Lackawanna Cut-Off, and certainly hopefully you'll look forward to part 8 on the Lackawanna Cut-Off series of videos.